Chapter 2. Summoned. The prince dressed hurriedly in the best robes he owned, midnight black like all of his clothing, but with golden scroll work across the shoulders and down the arms. He placed on his head the circlet that signified his position as the Prince of Ravens, a small, frontless crown made of two curving golden wings set with veins of onyx and jet. He glanced at himself quickly in the looking-glass, grateful that he'd washed and shaved barely an hour earlier, and then left his rooms quickly, his heavy robes swirling around him. Outside his room, the two black-clothed guardians who watched over him day and night fell seamlessly into step behind him, following him as silently and swiftly as shadows, despite the fact that they were both over 7 feet tall. As he moved down the hall, he passed tapestries depicting famous battles and deeds of the Empress and her children. His body felt oddly light. A weight seemed to have fallen off his shoulders now that he finally had something to do. He had never been very good at waiting around while events unfolded. He kept reaching down to his left hip to clutch the hilt of a sword that wasn't there. He'd been given it at the age of 10, and over the years it had become as much a part of him as an arm or a leg. A week ago, it had been brutally amputated. Only those with names carried weapons. But that too would soon be remedied. He was to receive his inheritance. Maybe the next time he walked down this corridor it would be past a tapestry of him. The thought made him smile, but in a rueful way that lacked pleasure. He rounded a corner, and as he did, a young woman walked out of a room in front of him in a swirl of perfume and fine red silks. She turned and gave a small gasp of surprise when she saw him standing right in front of her. The prince moved to brush past her, but stopped when he realized who it was. Leah Monsun was the daughter of one of the Most High. The Monsun family was on the rise in the politics of the palace, and Leah had been introduced to the prince a little over a week before in the hopes that he would take a liking to her and bestow favor. The prince, highly skeptical when Joffred had first arranged the meeting, had found himself struck embarrassingly dumb by her beauty, and he had been anxious to meet with her again ever since. She was the most stunning woman he had ever met, with long, chestnut hair, a figure that filled out anything she wore, and a soft mouth that was quick to laugh at his dry and sarcastic humor that so often turned others away. "Lady Monsun," the prince said, not having to fake the sudden stirring of happiness he felt at seeing her. The lady clutched a hand to her chest. Her eyes were as wide as if she'd seen a ghost. The prince did his best not to look down at what that hand was clutching. "Are you well, lady? I didn't mean to frighten you." When she didn't respond, he repeated himself more slowly. "Are you well, lady?" He reached out a hand, concerned that she looked none too steady. "My prince," she said, dropping a hasty curtsy and lowering her eyes. As a member of the Most High, she was allowed in his presence, but not allowed to look him in the eye unless permitted. He had given her permission. "My lady, why won't you look at me?" His bluntness seemed to put her off even more, as if his acknowledgement of her actions made them shameful. She didn't look up, but instead dropped into another curtsy. "I'm so sorry, my prince, but I am on the way to an appointment with my father. It is an emergency. May I go?" Of course," he responded. It wasn't like him to stammer, and normally he would have wondered over his tripping tongue, but now he could only watch, dumbfounded, as the young woman turned and all but ran from him. He knew she hadn't been telling the truth. He didn't need Samantha's snake talisman to tell him that. A sudden foreboding took hold of him as he watched her turn a corner and disappear. He began to walk again, slowly at first, but then more quickly, until he was nearly running, the guardians following close behind him. A thought occurred to him. She had been warned to stay away from him. The way she had started in his presence, the combination of fear and surprise on her face, it all said she hadn't expected to see him here. Here, where he lived and was bound to be. He shook his head to dispel the thought. He needed to see Mother. Everything would be made clear once he could speak to her. Perhaps even this was part of the task that would earn him his inheritance. The rest of the journey to the tower was uneventful, though quite long since his rooms were in the lowest of the fortress's 7 spires. He moved as quickly as he could through the long hallways and corridors, past the grand reception halls on the lower levels and the apartments of the Most High connected to his siblings on the upper. He took a shortcut through the grand training rooms of the Guardians, full of clockwork sparring enemies and training equipment, and finally arrived at the enormous doors that led to the Hall of 1,000 Glories, where sat the Diamond Throne. The doors, originally wood but so heavily gilded it was impossible to tell, were so massive that it took 20 slaves stationed there day and night to open them. One of the Most High had once proposed that the doors remained closed except for visits of state, hearings, and proclamations so as to save on slaves. When the Empress disapproved, he claimed it was a jest. So the Empress had a jester brought from the city to throw him from the top of the fortress spire, so as to save on slaves. As the prince approached the doors, a full fist of 10 guardians came forward, dressed in blinding white uniforms and full plate armor, great helms tucked under their arms opposite their great swords. "My prince," said the captain, carefully looking just below the prince's eyes. He was not of the Most High, nor even of the High, but was simply a guardian, and as such existed outside the social order. He would never meet the eyes of one of the children. "Open the doors. My mother has summoned me." "Yes, my prince," the captain responded. "She left this for you." He held up a steel plate, engraved with gold scrollwork, on which lay a cushion and a roll of parchment. The prince took the parchment and read quickly. The message was only a single sentence and a brief one at that. "Await my presence in the antechamber." There was no signature, but the message was his mother's. No one else would have dreamed of commanding one of the children. "Very well," he said, replacing the scroll. He turned to the left, where a single well-polished mahogany door was set in the stone wall. His 2 trailing guardians, their black armor making them look like shadowy rites next to the blinding white of the Empress's personal guard, took up positions to either side of the door as he twisted the crystal knob and entered. The room was dark, lit with only a pair of oil lamps in wall sconces. They were situated on either side of a long table that ran down the center of the room, flanked by a number of intricately carved, high-backed wooden chairs. There was no one else in the room, and after the door closed behind him, there was nothing but a heavy silence that covered him like a thick blanket. There should have been someone there. A clockwork servant, perhaps, one of Joffred's many inventions, if not a human slave to offer him refreshment. A simple oversight, no doubt, but one that would not go unpunished. He walked slowly down the side of the table, tracing a gloved finger along the polished wood. He felt oddly calm. The door at the opposite end of the anteroom crashed open. Shocked, he dropped his hand once more to his hip, reaching for his missing sword. But there was no cause for alarm. It was only a handful of slaves, carrying what looked to be a tablecloth. The fools were simply late. He supposed he had left his quarters rather abruptly. He must have beaten the news of his arrival. "Where were you?" he asked imperiously, his voice coming out much more harshly than he'd intended. Silence followed his question, though, and just that quickly he knew something was wrong after all. One did not ignore the children. The slaves, human ones, the Raven Talisman told him, approached, and they moved with sharp, decisive movements that were completely at odds with the subdued nature of a fortress slave. "You will stop where you are," he commanded. They ignored him, and instead broke into a run down the sides of the table, unsheathing long daggers from beneath their gray rags. Automatically, the prince fell into a defensive stance as the first man came for him, his training taking control of his body. He stepped quickly inside the man's reach, grabbed his wrists, and broke them with 2 sharp blows. The man cried out in pain, and the dagger fell from his numb grip, into the prince's hand. He spun around and stabbed the man in the chest, careful to avoid the heart, seeking only to leave the man incapacitated. His attacker let out a hiss of surprise and pain and fell back into the man behind him, bearing them both to the ground. 2 other men jumped onto the table on the prince's right, blades flashing. With 2 quick motions, the prince struck the legs out beneath one of them and hamstrung the other with his stolen dagger. The prince felt a prick in his neck, and a sudden numbing sensation descended along his arm, and then across his shoulders. He looked up and saw one of the ambushers on the far side of the table with a Dapt Singh, a dart gun that was used exclusively in the lands to the south. Rebels? In the fortress? But then the toxin had flowed to his brain, and all thoughts were banished. Darkness swirled in on him, and the last image he had was of the inside of a sack, sewn to look like a tablecloth.